Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of our May News Literacy Webinar Professional Development Series. My name is John Silva. I'm part of the education team at the News Literacy Project. I am joined by my colleagues on the education team, Miriam Romais, who is going to be helping me with the Q&A box. So as we're going through this webinar, you'll notice that there's a button for Q&A where you can type in your questions. And we're going to be recording this. Miriam, I think there was a couple of questions you wanted to answer before we got started, or a couple housekeeping things. Sorry, Miriam, you are muted, looks like.
There we go. Speaking of, we have everybody muted. That included me. My apologies. We do have everybody muted. We are going to be doing questions. We have a couple of Q&A sections built into the session, but there's going to be plenty of time at the end as well. As we go through it, I'll be, seeing if there's anything that makes more sense to answer right away. So we'll be filtering that. We will make the recording of the presentation available at the end. So you'll have access to a PDF of the presentation too. So everything is going to be shared at the end of the presentation. And we'll be looking forward to kind of going through it and helping you all do what you do best. We're also being joined by our colleague, Jordan, who is in our chat room. We can answer things in both directions, but if you have an actual question with regards to the presentation, please use the Q&A box. And
thank you. One of the things I want to mention is that we will not be able to get to all of the questions in the Q&A. However, one of the really cool features of Zoom is that we'll be able to download those into a document, and we will answer the ones we don't get to offline and send those as well. And one other thing, we will also be providing a link where you can download a certificate of attendance for CPDU or CEU credit with your district. So I just want to start by just on behalf of the News Literacy Project and behalf of the education team in particular, we just wanted to say, Happy Teacher Appreciation Week. We know how difficult this has got to be for a lot of you. We're really happy to be able to providing this professional development and these resources. And so we're going to be doing everything we can over the next couple of months to try to support you as best we can. But I just wanted to say this, especially given my background. If you are active on social media, feel free to chat about this, to engage with us using the hashtag news-lit-pd. This is the organization Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook handles. Our social media guy, Jake, is going to be tracking this, and so hopefully this is something where we can engage with each other in an ongoing way. And you can follow us for some of the things that we also share, throughout the day and all week in terms of news literacy and misinformation and a lot of the topics that we're going to be talking about today. So as I mentioned, this is part of our series. So this is the very first one. We have 3 others each Thursday at 2 o'clock Eastern. We'll be doing these throughout the month. Towards the end, I will share the link if you have not had a chance to register for the other 3 sessions. There are still plenty of slots available for all of those. So today's topic is what it means to be news literate. And so when we're talking about news literacy and we're talking about these skills, the purpose of this is to really talk about, so when you go through news literacy with your students, when you've integrated this into your curriculum, what does it look like for a student to be news literate? And this is a series of, some of these are skills, some of these are habits, some of these are tools, but the idea is that when you go through with this, these are the things that students should be able to do. As I mentioned, I'm part of the education team. Prior to joining the News Literacy Project, I was a social studies teacher in Chicago Public Schools for 13 years. I taught middle and high school. That's my Twitter handle that you can see there on the screen. I do share a lot of information about news literacy and misinformation. I do also a lot focusing on civic engagement. And one topic I've also been spending a lot of time on is with conspiracy theories and some of those things. But also I try to talk about things that are practical and sharing of resources. So if you are active on Twitter, if you'd like to follow me, there's my handle. So one of the first things that I want to start off with is just to frame a lot of what we talk about when we're doing this stuff in news literacy, is that this is really something that is of critical importance. We need to be doing more to teach young people how to sort fact from fiction, how to be news literate. Because especially when we're talking about what their lives are going to be like, what kind of adults are they going to be, how are they going to be engaged civically, how you process information, how you prioritize reliable sources of information, all of that goes into every decision that you make. And when we talk about civic engagement, being able to reliably assess information is really important because it is so complicated out there. It is overwhelming how much information from how many sources and all of the ways that we can share information with each other. It is incredibly complicated and overwhelming, but there are opportunities for empowerment, for civic actions, for civic engagement. And it really is on us as educators, as adults, as parents, to teach young people how to do this. Because if we don't help them, if we don't prepare them, then they're not going to be able to engage in this information landscape in a responsible way. And so when we talk about news literacy, this is what we mean. So part of it is about determining credibility. What can I trust? What can I verify to be true? And when we're talking about news, we also need to recognize that we need to be informed from news organizations that follow what we call the standards of quality journalism. This is fact-based journalism and knowing how to recognize these standards, and when they're not following them, it gives us an opportunity to engage with the news in a more reliable and informed way. And hopefully when you are better informed and you care more about what's going on, you may be more likely to participate in the civic life of your community, however you choose to define that community. So I just want to frame a couple of things so we understand just why this is such a huge issue. Some of this is going to be familiar to you. So some of these are from the SIF, for example. So we have rumors out there. People are sharing things that are easily proven false. So for example, this from Twitter, we see this idea that all the Vegas hotels have donated food except for the Trump International Hotel. It's completely false. It's easily debunked, but people will share it without even really taking the time to think about it or verify it. And you can see when we took this screenshot, it had 40,000 likes and 20,000 retweets. That's a viral rumor that, you know, we don't know how many people believed it and shared it as opposed to people who were trying to debunk it. So rumors on Twitter are in particular very common. This is an example from Instagram. Political propaganda, hyper-partisan propaganda, where people are trying to inflame opinions to get people to accept a premise without really thinking about it. Propaganda is also very common. It's an issue that we have to think about. How do we evaluate this claim? Conspiracy theories are running rampant right now. They've been around forever, obviously, but right now there's so much misinformation and conspiracy theories surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic and other things. And this is a post that I found on Facebook. And then following along that lines, straight up misinformation relating to the anti-vaccine here. This is an example from TikTok. Now, one of the interesting things when I show this in particular is that I think a lot of adults don't realize just how much misinformation and conspiracy theories are on TikTok. It's not just kids doing dances and lip syncs. There is a great deal of misinformation on TikTok, and this is one of those things where we have to recognize that any popular social media platform is going to have this. And the most important point I want to mention, that I've shown you examples from 4 different platforms. When we talk about news literacy, the platform actually doesn't matter. The skills that we're going to be talking about apply to the content and the source of that content, not the platform. We evaluate this information no matter where it comes from. So we have to focus on the skills and not so much on the platform, but we have to recognize that it comes from so many different sources. And so one question I want you to think about as we get into this, thinking about your students, if they were to see these and then just Google them, what would they find? What kind of information would they find, and how would they engage with it? And what kind of rabbit holes might they end up going down? And what other things might they be exposed to because of the algorithms that are trying to show them things that they like or have shown interest in? That's how a lot of these things work. So we have to really think about how do we intercede so that kids can reliably investigate these without going down those rabbit holes. And so the question that is our essential question at the education team at the News Literacy Project is thinking about your students. Can they tell the difference between fact and fiction? Hopefully you think you have a good sense that yes, they probably do, but when we're done with this series, hopefully you will be able to say that they will be able to tell the difference, because I'm really going to make an effort to bring some news literacy to them and teach a lot of these skills. So let's get into the skills and talk about what this looks like. So one of the first ones that we want to talk about actually has nothing to do with the technology. It's all about us. When we're talking about our emotional responses to information that comes across our feeds. Because the thing is that misinformation and propaganda and conspiracy theories, these are all designed to get us to believe something because of an emotional response, not a rational one. The stronger the emotional response, the less likely we are to pause and think about it. We are more likely to simply share it out of reflex. And really thinking about those emotional responses, that's a first warning sign. Now, fortunately, with most adults, the rational parts of our brain will kick back in fairly quickly so that we will apply some thought to it. But we always have to remember that adolescents in particular are very vulnerable to being manipulated by misinformation simply because of adolescent brain development. The rational parts of their brains are only just beginning to develop in the late teens, and it's not even fully developed until about the mid-20s. So when we're talking about adolescents, we're really only talking about the emotional centers of their brains. And so they need to have some skills to be able to recognize and deal with these emotional responses so that they can apply some processes and some tools to be able to evaluate. Another key skill, these are what I think are two of the most important in terms of the emotions, but then differentiating news from opinion. When we're talking about sources of news, there is so much opinion out there, especially when we talk about national televised news networks. It's incredible how much commentary and opinion and analysis is out there as opposed to actual news. So being able to recognize the differences between news and opinion, if we're trying to be informed, we need to be able to prioritize news and set aside the opinions for a time when we actually want to evaluate claims and things like that. So teaching the differences between news and opinion is really important. Now, fortunately, one of our tools is called Informable. It is a free brain training style app that we've developed. It's on the Google Play Store and through Apple. So here's an example that in this app when we talk about the difference between news and opinion. You can see from this example, the handle says post opinions. There's a tag there that says from the editorial board. Those are clear indications that this is an opinion piece. Now, this example from the Wall Street Journal doesn't have those things. There's no labels that says opinion or commentary. But we wouldn't just be able to clearly say that that's news. We'd have to look at a number of different things. So when we talk about how we do this, one of the first ways is to talk about what is opinion. Because it's easier to look for clues about what an opinion piece might be as opposed to a news, because in a lot of ways, news is the absence of a lot of these things. So reputable organizations will have their opinions and their commentaries clearly labeled. The writing style of the piece will likely be in the first person. It will include tone and language that is persuasive. And there's a lot of things like hyperbole and exaggeration. So being able to recognize the signs of what an opinion piece is important. When we talk about recognizing news, we also want to talk about what those standards of quality journalism that I mentioned a few minutes ago are. So when we look for news, we need to look for know what to look for in terms of a piece that is talking about that it's verified information from multiple quality sources. The tone of the what you're reading, it has, you can see fairness, provides context, and there's these key things that you would find in news, but it's not as easy to spot as a label such as opinion or commentary. So being able to recognize some of these differences is a really important skill to teach and to reinforce if we're prioritizing being informed. One of the more complicated topics is discussions of bias. There's a lot of talk about bias. News organizations and journalists are accused of bias all the time, but we want to do this. So I'm going to show you some headlines, and I'm going to pull up a poll question here. And so the question is, looking at this headline, do you perceive bias in this headline? And so it says, Theodore Roosevelt, USS Theodore Roosevelt, commander relieved of duty. I'm just going to leave the poll question up here for one quick second. Okay, so it looks like about close to 70% of people are saying, about 67, no, it's 66%. No, there's no perception of bias, but about 20% are. Okay. Okay, so the next question, I'm going to show you another headline. So this is, the Navy removes aircraft carrier captain who raised alarm about coronavirus response. So I'm going to launch a second question here. And now the question is this more biased, less biased, or about the same? Okay, so it looks like we're skewing towards this being more biased than the first. But about 30% are saying it's about the same. Okay. All right, I'm going to show you a third headline. This is commander of aircraft carrier hit by coronavirus removed for poor judgment after sounding alarm. So this is going to be the same question. Is this more biased, less biased, or about the same? Okay, looks like we've got about 70% are saying that it's more, and then about an interesting split between less biased and about the same. So the interesting thing is that when we're talking about bias, one of the first things that we have to talk about is, I'm going to show you, okay, one more, sorry. I'm going to show you one more here. So this is, rank these from most to least biased. So basically the question is going to be, which headline do you think is the most biased? Okay, so according to the results, 81% indicated that headline 3 was the most biased, and then 13 for headline 2 and 7 for headline 1. So the interesting thing that I want to mention here when we talk about bias is that the first thing is we were just talking about perceptions. So each of us looked at these 3 headlines and we made a judgment call based on how we perceive different parts of these headlines, the presence or absence of additional details. So it raises some questions because when we talk about bias, we need to find a way to get to a more objective way of evaluating and talking about bias. So there are some questions that come up. So the first thing is, are these headlines straight news pieces? Because if these were headlines from commentary, then discussions of bias would be irrelevant, because commentary, opinion, by their very nature, are meant to be biased. If we determine that they are straight news pieces, when we look at the headlines, are they factual, right? So some of the things that we may have looked at in those three headlines, we may have talked about, we may have perceived that as being biased, but the question is, are they accurate? Are they factual? Are those key details to this? And when we're talking about bias, we want our students to be able to clearly explain what type of bias we see, and recognize that sometimes we may be projecting our own biases on the headlines that we see. So I want to show you the sources from this, and this really reinforces that last point about our own biases. If I had shown you the logo or the masthead from these headlines at the very beginning, most of you probably would have ranked these differently, because we would have been projecting our perceptions of these news organizations and how we perceive them to be biased, in a lot of ways politically, but in other ways. But these are all straight news pieces. None of them are commentary. And the details that are in these headlines are all factual. In the order removing the commander from duty, the Navy cited specifically poor judgment in his handling of the issue of coronavirus, COVID-19 on his ship. So there's a lot of questions that we can talk about in evaluating these. Now, in the Checkology virtual classroom, if you have not yet started using it, we will be providing information about it. We have a lesson on understanding bias, where we break down the topic of bias first into what we call these 5 types of bias. So trying to get to a more objective way of evaluating bias. And then we talk about forms of bias, which is the way that those types can sort of express themselves in news and information. But it's a way of getting sort of away from perceptions and opinions and more into how do we have an objective way of measuring bias. Now, when we talk about news organizations, many of you have probably seen charts like these that are trying to rank news organizations or sources of information based on their political affiliation or their political bias. They're very popular. A lot of people use these, but there are some issues with them when we're talking about determining bias. The first goes back to that issue of the difference between news and opinion. A lot of these charts that you see are based on the opinion writing or the editorial boards of those news organizations. But some of the thing is, some of those organizations don't even try to be neutral or unbiased. They're all about sharing commentary. And there's a lot of ways that we can debate these. They can be very subjective. And bias is a very complex issue. And so one of the things that we really tried to get to with the lesson on understanding bias is a way of breaking it down into an easier way of looking at some objective standards. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to open up the Q&A. And I'm hoping, let's see.
Hi, John.
Yes.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions that I thought might be good to just answer live.
Okay.
We have one person that wanted to know about a best source to find news literacy standards.
Okay, so news literacy standards, the interesting thing is there really aren't any common sets of standards out there. But actually, here at the News Literacy Project, we are working on developing a set of standards. We are working on, we have a project in the works where we're developing a framework for teaching news literacy. Many of the standards that you would find are actually more about the difference, the intersection of sort of news and media literacy and civics. There's one that I see here from Susie Boyd.
I was just
How is NPR said to be middle? It is very liberal. So the interesting thing when we talk about this, Susie, yes, you can look at the opinion pieces and the commentary in these different organizations and see a political bias. But if we look at the news pieces, the straight news, and we apply those standards of quality journalism, most news organizations, especially the national news organizations, you will see that their coverage follows those standards, and especially in terms of verification, multiple quality sources, and fairness and that sort of thing. we can talk more about that a bit later. Okay, any other questions about the first couple things that you saw, Miriam, that I should take a look at?
We have one that that mentions bias, the fact of what is being reported, like the choices of what are being reported and what isn't, what is omitted.
Yeah, so story selection is a type of bias that we talk about in the lesson. You know, that there's that part of that connects into news judgments and things like that. But, you know, choosing which stories to cover, you know, those are difficult decisions. So story selection is a type of bias, and, you know, maybe giving one type of story or one story more coverage than another. But yeah, that is a more objective way that we can try to get to it. But again, a lot of this still gets into that subjective perception areas.
And then discerning between quality among editorial or opinion pieces.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So Jessica, that's a really good question, because we do have another lesson in the platform called Arguments and Evidence. So one of the things that we want to encourage young people to do is when they're looking at opinion pieces and commentary, those pieces, quality pieces, should be supported by evidence. They should be supported by things that we can evaluate. And one of the most important things that I like to emphasize is, if we're talking about opinion and propaganda, a quality opinion piece is going to encourage discourse, right? It's going to encourage this idea of engaging with each other and talking about something and sharing ideas. Whereas propaganda is just going to try to influence us and persuade us and inflame our emotions to follow a particular piece. So that's how I would approach that. Let's see. So Jessica, I don't say that all sides is not reliable. I think that those charts do have some important purposes if we're looking at the perceptions of political bias, but I think it's more effective for some of those hyper-partisan blogs and propaganda sites and things. It's not an effective chart if we're looking at news coverage. Okay, so I'm going to move on, and we'll try to answer some more of these questions a bit later when we do another towards the end. So another thing mentioning about evaluating evidence. So one really important skill that we want to talk about is if there is evidence to support a claim in a social media post. So this is another mode from our Informable app. So this is something that you might see someone making this big claim about margarine and being so close to plastic. But if you look at this, if you actually just look at it and just think about it critically, you would be able to realize that there just really isn't any evidence to support what it is. It's just making a claim. Whereas this example from the Pew Research Center, it's telling us the statistic from a poll, but it's actually doing two really important things that the other one isn't. It's showing us this chart, which is evidence for us to look at. We can see some of the data, but the other piece, which is actually more important, is that there's a link that we can click on and we can evaluate this and we can see the evidence and we can read more about it ourselves. And so when we look at these side by side, one of the issues is that a lot of young people, they don't take that step back and really look to see if there's evidence to support the claim that's here. So we really want to be emphasizing to young people, don't just take things at face value. Here's an example that actually has been going on in recent weeks. So this is a video that was shot. This Twitter account is claiming that hospitals are empty, that the COVID-19 pandemic is overblown and exaggerated. And this hashtag Film Your Hospital has been trending. And when I took this recording, there were almost 34,000 likes and almost 22,000 retweets. A lot of people have been doing this, trying to go out and filming hospitals. But what does it really show? I mean, we don't know exactly where this is, when this video was taken. We could probably look closely to verify that it might actually be a hospital, but there's really no evidence to suggest that, like, what this person is trying to claim, that these war zones aren't happening, because we can't see what's happening inside. But this is another type of thing that it's very partisan. It's misleading. It's trying to get us to have an emotional response, and a lot of people are sharing this along those same lines. But there's no evidence to really show what this person is claiming. So I adapted these questions from the Stanford History Education Group. They have this curriculum called Civic Online Reasoning. When we're talking about how do we engage with these posts and such, there are some questions that we can ask. And these will look very familiar to probably almost all of you, right? So who is the source? Can we actually look into the information about this, the source of this information, and determine their credibility? Is there evidence that we can look at for ourselves? Can we determine the source of that evidence? Can we evaluate the credibility of that source? And then if we determine that both are credible, then we need to look at the connection. Is there a connection between what the claim is, and if the evidence actually proves that claim? So it takes several steps for us to be able to go through this, but it's a really important process that we want to reinforce with young people so that they can really understand when something is being proven or when something is just a wild claim. Other ways, so some of the ways that we can do this in terms of evaluating evidence, but just verifying information, I'm going to show you two really important fact-checking skills. The first is called lateral reading. So here's an example. Here's a fake quote from claiming to be from Ronald Reagan. So if I wanted to check this out, what do I mean by lateral reading? So it's not just searching, it's about searching in a deliberate way. There are some tools and strategies that we can use. So for example, don't just put in random terms into the search bar. You can use quotation marks to search for a phrase. You can use plus and minus signs to require or exclude a term. Knowing what type of search engines to use. These are all really important tools to work on. And another skill is what we call click restraint. Don't just click on the very first link that you see. You really need to evaluate what you see in the search results, and then try to choose the ones that you think would be most reliable and relevant. And then when you open those up, evaluate the information that you see, evaluate the sources, do that critical analysis. And then really it's about at what point do you feel comfortable saying that, okay, I know that this is true, or I know that this is false. And it's a process that we want young people to do. So I'm going to show you this screen recording about how I investigated that claim from Reagan. So I've turned this into the phrase, I phrase it as a question, which is a good way for Google to recognize that you might be doing a fact check. I could have put the whole quote in quotation marks, but you can see that right away I have a Snopes, a PolitiFact, and a factcheck.org site. If I scroll down, I could have seen others, but I'm going to pull up this factcheck.org site, for example, and I'm going to take a look at this. Now, I don't just take them at face value either. I need to evaluate this source, right? I need to know, are they telling me what the claim is? Are they showing me evidence? Can I look at where that evidence comes from? Who is factcheck.org? So here, for example, factcheck.org, it says it has some transparency here that they're working with Facebook to debunk misinformation. And it will also show us the sources. So evaluating those, not just the search results, but the fact check itself. Another really important tool that we want to emphasize is called the reverse image search. Because a lot of misinformation is image-based, this is a really important tool to work with students. A reverse image search is basically a specialized search engine that's going to try to match the pixel pattern of the image you're searching with images that are in its database. Most reverse image searches are going to try to show you images that match or images that are similar. And it's really about how they present the search results. There are three really good ones. Images.google.com is one. TinEye and Yandex are two others. There are a number of ways that you can search. There's also an app. There are many apps that you can also download on your phones. But one of the most important things I want to emphasize is that those evaluation skills in terms of like looking at all the results, exercising click restraints, it's the same for reverse image search as with lateral reading. So here's an example of an image that has gone viral a couple of times over the last few years, claiming to be Che Guevara. Looks like he's about to shoot these two young women. You can find it all across social media. It hits some really strongly held political opinions, focusing on socialism and communism. So how would I investigate this? So the simplest way to do a reverse image search is to move your cursor over the image and you right click, and there's an option called search Google for image. And again, I'm going to look through the search results here. So I see there's a Snopes article, another fact check. There's a Wikipedia article about Che Guevara, probably not going to be useful. If I continue scrolling down, Google's going to show me pages that include matching images. So I'm going to go to another, this is going to be a fact check from AFP. The first thing they're going to tell me is it's false, but I don't want to just stop there. I need to know why. How are they able to tell me why this is false? So they're going to give us some context. They're going to show us where it's been shared. So it's been shared in a number of places over the last couple of years. It gives us some background, where they get this from. And we actually learn that it's not Che Guevara at all. It's actually from the Guerrilla Theater Company at Emory College in Atlanta. It was taken in March of 1989. And they actually provide a link to their website, but then they also show us the two images side by side so that we can actually see the evidence. So they're not just telling us it's false, they're showing it to us, they're telling us why. And these are really important skills that we need to emphasize with young people about how to fact check things for themselves. So I'm going to pause again here just to see if there are some questions specifically about fact checking or evaluating evidence. I'm just going to go through, let's see. So some of these we're going to answer more towards the end.
Focus specifically on fact checking.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many.
Norman Rentz writes here, news was once confirmed by more than one source before being reported. It doesn't seem to be happening now. Why? Seems to have reduced the value of mainstream news. I think that in reality, though, I think there are sometimes when you see something that is reporting using one source, but actually, I think the overwhelming majority of quality journalism that's out there, they are using more than one source. It's one of those tricky things where sometimes sources are not really explicitly mentioned in a news article. There may be sources on background, but it's really about looking at some of those things critically throughout the article.
Do you think the NewsGuard browser extension is a good tool?
Honestly, I don't know enough about NewsGuard's browser extension to be able to answer that. So if someone uses the NewsGuard extension, if you could please put some comments in the chat box, we will try to share those with others. Michael Evans, I've noticed the News-Literate Project holds journalism up as the gold standard of reliable information online. But what about other kinds of quality information available online, like reports from reputable organizations and peer-reviewed academic research? Yes, we do hold journalism up as a really important source of information, because that's our mission. Because we believe that journalism is vitally important, not only for us as a source of information, but it's also vitally important to the health of our democracy. Yes, there are other sources of information that are available, but journalism is one of the most common that we engage with every day. People do use reports from reputable organizations and peer-reviewed journals and such like that. And yes, those are really valuable sources, especially in an academic setting. But most people are not using those in their day-to-day lives, and they're not as influenced by how they're informed as they are by journalism. So that is our focus at the News-Literacy Project. That is part of our mission. When news is more blended with opinion, how is it possible to distinguish between them? I think if you can see opinion that is expressed in it, you may not be looking at news. However, a news organization, a reputable news piece may quote someone who's expressing an opinion, but a quality news piece will also present the other side, or provide different viewpoints to provide important context. Let's see. When teaching, so Roberto Rodriguez, when teaching our students to verify the claims, how can we establish a trust between our students and the source for verification? I think I would sort of say that just like we would expect students to show their work when they're doing math, we expect fact checkers to show their work, how they'd be able to verify information. We should hold our students to that same standard, that if they're looking for verification, they should be able to tell us where they got it from and how they know they can trust it. This is one of those things where students also have to show their work.
That's a good segue for this other question, which also relates to need to fact check. I have a student who seems to hold more of a conspiracy theory outlook, and like many of us, gets emotionally involved in his ideas and thoughts and seems set on them. How can I help him think through other ideas while also honoring his own views?
Yeah. When we start talking about it's not just conspiracy theories. When we talk about belief, it can be a very difficult conversation to have, because the more we believe something, the more strongly we believe something, it's really hard for us to be comfortable with having that being challenged. And I think that it can be good for someone to have a belief, but I think the emphasis that we want to do when we're talking about news literacy and these skills is it's not just what you believe, it's what can you prove. And that can get into some very tricky territory depending on what type of belief we have. But yes, it can be very difficult to break through that. We're actually developing a new lesson right now on conspiratorial thinking and conspiracy theories, and we're hoping to have that available in the next school year. But yeah, it is a tough topic, but it's one where I think the way you do that is to establish some ground rules with your students that, like, we're not going to talk about only what we believe. We're going to talk about what our beliefs and try to support why we believe them, and try to find evidence to support our beliefs so that we can get to a point of discourse where we can share information. Jeanette Lawrence with a reverse image search, what do you use to evaluate the sources? It's the same sort of thing as that, like, we can do additional lateral reading. We can look to sort of see who it is. Some of it's just really about our own skills, our own interpretation. We should be able to see the evidence. So for example, I should be able to look to see if it's matched, if it's the same image. And if this news source is a fact check, is it telling me where, what the determination is? Can I determine who took it? And it's about those same questions about credibility. I need to be able to evaluate that. There are some checklists that we do talk about from time to time about determining credibility. I don't have one in particular that I prefer. A lot of this is really about looking at the information in front of us and taking care of that. I'm going to answer one more question, then I'm going to move on to finish a couple things. So Kara Duriez, while Wikipedia should not be a primary source, using it as a starting point to find more reliable sources, usually at the bottom of the page, is not a bad thing. I could not agree more with the use of Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia is an amazing source for factual information. Often Wikipedia has the most up-to-date information about a lot of topics. But again, just like she mentioned, we need to look to see where that information came from, looking at the sources. It is a starting point. It should never really be the end point. But I think that a lot of teachers need to find a way of getting comfortable with how we can use Wikipedia as a source of facts and information, because we all use it ourselves. One other one, I'll just really quick. What about deep fakes from Howard Shulkin? Deep fakes are really difficult for the average person to be able to investigate. A lot of deep fakes are really easy to spot. There's a lot of visual cues that don't line up, and you can see that something is a deep fake. The technology is getting better, but what we really would focus on is, instead of trying to investigate the video itself, doing some lateral reading and searching to see if somebody else has already debunked it. Okay, I'm going to go through a couple other skills, and then we should have time for a bit more Q&A, and then we're going to share some of our resources.
Yes, so a reminder real quick, that because there are so many questions and so few of us trying to type furiously here, that we will answer them afterwards as well, and at the end, or we'll create a PDF that we'll share in our resource folder with your answers. So we're reading them and typing as fast as we can.
Thank you. Okay, let's talk about satire for a second. So we're all familiar with The Onion. The Onion is a well-known source of satire. But one of the interesting things is that it used to be focused on just very funny, very ridiculous things like this. But like a lot of satire today, in the last couple of years, it has gotten more political. And in this shift of satire being more political, it is actually becoming very common for people not to recognize something as satire and sharing it as if it was real. Now, the Onion, it doesn't happen as much, but there's another one, for example, the Babylon Bee. It is not as well known as the Onion, and it is also very political. And people share these articles from the Babylon Bee as if it's from a real news source, not realizing that it's satire. And if you go to their so this is their Twitter page, their Twitter account, you can see right there it says fake news you can trust. But one of the challenges is that people don't take that step before they share it. They don't click on the profile to see who posted this article or who shared this article before they share it. But it's not just these sort of organizations like the Babylon Bee and the Onion that are trying to create satire. Some of it just comes from people like this guy.
So I'm sitting here on a Friday night enjoying my ice cold beer, and what do I see come across my Fox News? The CDC wants you and me and God and everybody else to wear a face mask, and that just pisses me off.
So the thing is that this guy puts out these videos. He's a comedian, right? That's a character that he's created for his style of comedy. But people interact with that, they engage with it, they comment on it, they share it, not realizing that that's not a real person, that's a character. And when you see this right here, clearly he's labeled as a comedian. He actually changed this in recent months. I don't have a screenshot of the original one, but his account actually used to be more along the lines of what that character looks like. So talking about satire as misinformation is really important, because we have to remember that if something makes us laugh, that's also an emotional response. And the more we think something is funny, we may be more likely to share something without thinking about it. But at the same time, satire can make us angry, especially if it feeds into a political viewpoint. And a lot of times we don't necessarily see that satire from the original source. It can be shared easily out of context. Sometimes people will rip it off and share it in other ways. People will create things where they're just trying to be funny, and it goes viral for all the wrong reasons, and they try to claim that it's satire. But again, we need to emphasize with young people that before you share it, you need to check it out. You need to investigate it and verify what it is that you're looking for, not just the content, but also the source. And then one of the last points I want to talk about is about clicking the links with articles that people share. So I'm going to show you an example. So in 2016, Ronda Rousey, MMA fighter, posted this article saying, why doesn't NPR read, or why don't Americans read anymore, with an article from NPR. And when you look at this, you can see in the comments and the threads, people have opinions as to why that is, right? They say that people are lazy and stupid, that they read Twitter and Snapchat, and all these things. People have all these opinions about why Americans don't read anymore. But they never read the article, because had they clicked on it, they would have discovered that it's actually an April Fool's joke from NPR. It has nothing to do with whether or not people read. It's really about the fact, yeah, they don't, because they don't click on the links. And this is actually reinforced from a study done by the Columbia University and the French National Research Institute. They looked at links that were shared on Twitter, and they found that almost 60% of the time, people don't click on the link, but they will still engage with that content. They'll comment on it, they'll retweet it, they'll share it, whatever. They will have opinions as to what the article says, but they never clicked on it and never read it. I'm going to show you an example from earlier this year. So back in January, ABC News tweets out this story, that there's a bill that was proposed in Vermont that would have banned cell phones by anyone under the age of 21. Here's another one from CNN, same thing. Democratic State Senator John Rogers, here's this ban on cell phones. And when we look at some of the comments under these articles, people are saying like, hey, what's the reason? I believe kids have no business with phones. Nanny state, accusations of that. And the thing is, like, people are engaging with this, commenting on it, arguing with each other about it. but they never really looked to sort of see why that was. So here are two of them side by side. And one of the ones from, you can see the one on the right from MyNBC5, it has a little more context in it, but had you gone into the article and read it, he actually was doing it as a protest bill against what he felt was the state of Vermont's overreaching efforts at gun control. He even said that he had no intention of ever voting for it. He knew it would never pass. But the thing is, like, those are key details. And the reality is that you can never get enough in just a preview in a tweet to know what the details are in an article. So really teaching young people and a lot of our friends and family members, and a skill that we all need to start practicing ourselves, is before we engage with it, before we comment or retweet it, we have to stop, click it, and actually read the whole article. And I know that with young people, that's a lot easier said than done, but that's an important skill that we need to emphasize. So taking all of these skills that we've talked about in the last about 45 minutes, here's some questions that I want you to think about taking away from this. So when we think about these skills, what are the ways that these skills can connect to what you're teaching, to your subject area? I think for most of us, we can see a lot of really clear connections about evaluating sources, verifying information, prioritizing quality, reliable sources of information, and actually being deliberative about how we engage with information. But there's also some ways that we can think about not just our subject areas, but how can we connect to other people in our buildings? How can we connect to our colleagues who are teaching in other subject areas, to reinforce these skills, to show how they apply, not just academically, but this applies to, you know, science information, health news, statistics. There's so many different ways that we can talk about these. And then the last one, which is a bigger conversation that we all should be having when we talk about this, is that how do we do this in terms of vertical alignment? At what age do we start this? I know that there's some amazing teachers out there who've been doing this as young as 5th grade. My son, who's in 4th grade, has already learned a few of these from his teacher. But it's something that we need to think about. How do we do this younger? Most of our resources, when we do this, we target about an 8th to 10th grade range for many of our materials, but we are working on some of these. So I just want to reinforce the main point for all this is that I'm hoping that after we talk about this, that you can see the importance of information and how we're going to, you know, why we need to do this. So I want to just share, I know we have about 5 minutes. I want to share the resources first, and then I'll pause for questions for people who want to stay on. So at news-literate.org/coronavirus, we have a website where we're tracking and sharing information about misinformation relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is mainly geared towards the general public. The Checkology Virtual Classroom, this year, in the last couple months, we have dropped the paywall so educators can request free licenses for their students to use the Checkology Virtual Classroom to teach a lot of these skills and more. If you go to get.checkology.org, you can check that out. We will also share this link in the follow-up email. One of the things I would encourage you to look at is our journalist directory. It's called the Newsroom to Classroom program. You can search for journalists who would be able to connect to your students through via video conference and have some in-depth conversations about journalism. The SIFT, I'm hoping many of you already subscribe. The SIFT is a weekly newsletter that goes out on Mondays, where we share sort of the weekly roundup in terms of what's been going viral, what are the trends in misinformation, some suggestions for teaching and integration strategies. There are only 2 more issues of the SIFT left in May. When that second one comes out, the SIFT will be going on summer break, and it will be coming back, I believe, sometime in late August. I mentioned Informable, our brain training app. It is geared mainly towards the general public, but it's something that a lot of us can reinforce some of these key skills. It is totally free. It is also ad-free. You can see some of the modes that we teach in this. And then one last thing, we have a professional development event we call a News Lit Camp. It is an interactive, hopefully next year, in-person professional development event where we partner a school district with a local news organization, and we bring educators and journalists together to talk about news literacy, to talk about the profession of journalism, to talk about how to teach a lot of these things. If you think your school district might be interested in this, we have this bit.ly link. It is case sensitive. Feel free to fill out the form, or you can respond to one of the emails that we sent. It is a super engaging, really fun professional development event that we do. We will share this link out in the follow-up email. We have a shared folder. The copy of this presentation is going to be in this folder, a number of other resources. We're going to do that. And then the last thing, just to reinforce, we have 3 more news literacy webinars coming up. They're each Thursday. At the bottom there is a bit.ly link for registration. Next week, I'll be talking about trends in misinformation, how do we evaluate different types, and a lot of those things about how do we engage students in terms of misinformation. My colleague Peter Adams is going to be working on the last 2 about digital verification, really going into some deeper digital verification and digital forensic skills, more of those fact checking. And then the last one at the end of May is going to be a really in-depth conversation about understanding bias. So as I shift into questions, I'm going to stay online at least for the next little while to try to answer as many questions as I can. We need your feedback. The ways that we decide how to make these professional development webinars and things better and more engaging and more useful for you is from your feedback. So this link that's on your screen right now, there's only a couple of questions. We would love to hear your thoughts and comments on how well this webinar went, how useful and effective you felt it was, but also some general comments about how we can make them better. And again, the link is case sensitive. So we really appreciate your feedback. And now I'm going to try to jump into some of the questions and see how many I can get through. Miriam, did you identify a couple that I should take a look at first?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of patterns that I'm seeing here. There are several educators that are looking for suggestions on messaging because they're, it's not just, of course, teaching the kids, it's the parents getting involved and being either overly sensitive. And then we also have a couple of questions regarding confirmation bias being so strong in teens and, well, I dare say adults too, but that was a question.
Okay, so the first thing I want to mention is, talking with parents about this can be very tricky. So the first thing is, the News Literacy Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. Like we are rigidly nonpartisan. And one of the things that you really will never hear us do is to say you should trust source A over source B. Right? We don't make a recommendation about any particular news organizations. What we want people to do is to recognize that quality news can come from many different sources, not just news organizations. And it's really about recognizing the standards of quality journalism. So when we're talking to parents, but when we're also talking about to students, we're not talking about the news organizations necessarily. We're talking about the journalists and the news that they are publishing. We really want to emphasize that when we're looking at news, not opinion, that we should know how to be reliably informed from news that is presented in a way that follows those standards. And if we can focus on the standards and what quality news looks like, then we can maybe get a little bit away from the organizations. But the thing is that confirmation bias is very strong, and social media reinforces that because we do find ourselves in these echo chambers and filter bubbles, where if you think about the people that we're connected to on social media, most of them think like us and believe some of the same things. And so it's a vicious cycle that just reinforces a lot of those. And so it takes a really concerted effort on our part to try to break through that and get away from that. And Karen Rinn mentions that browsers skew results based on advertising and sales. I don't have it's not necessarily the browsers as much as it is the algorithms of the sites that you're going to. So for example, when you can go to YouTube on any browser, the content you're being shown is not necessarily from Google. It's from the algorithms and the tracking that YouTube is using. And discussions of algorithms can be difficult. We do have a lesson on algorithms in the Checkology Virtual Classroom, but recognizing how algorithms work to try to personalize information is difficult. But so I think the more important thing to focus on is not the browsers themselves as much as it is the algorithms, because those all work very similarly. Miriam, any other questions you think I should take a look at?
Here is Adam says he's curious about the efficacy of the flag of emotional response. The skill of recognizing emotional response is a warning sign, and it's a good one, but unfortunately it seems like much of our news will be emotionally disturbing for many people, especially during the pandemic. Just one example, many people had an emotional reaction when Governor Kemp of Georgia said that he just found out that asymptomatic people can pass the coronavirus after it was well known for weeks.
Okay, so the key that I want to emphasize there is that, yeah, I mean, we could be looking at a news report and have an emotional response. The important part of that to talk about young people is like, it's not just recognizing they'll have an emotional response, it's that evaluation of why I'm having an emotional response, right? Am I reading about something that happened in the world and I'm being told about that event from a news report and it's making me angry, as opposed to taking a look at something and it's a meme and it's making me angry, but when I look at it more closely, I realize that it's telling me something that's not true. Or it's trying to manipulate my emotions to believe something that has been taken out of context or has been changed in some way. It's really that why am I having an emotional response that's probably the more important question. But recognizing the emotional response is the first part, and then really diving into it and evaluating it.
So that taps into a question from Carolyn. Previously, when I've taught information literacy, we begin with looking at misinformation and our own emotional responses. Is this a good place to start, or would analyzing the argument first be better?
I don't know that one of those would necessarily be more effective than the other. I think really though, before you can analyze the argument effectively, you have to really try to think about what it is that you're looking at. But it's all part of a pattern of deliberate critical thinking and critical evaluation. And I think that it's, as you go through those, there are some patterns that will emerge. And it's going to be one of those things that each of us will hopefully develop our own habits, our own processes, once we know what the habits and skills and the tools are. So it's really kind of about all of them together in one way or another. But in the end, what we're hoping is that this becomes a personal process that we develop and we build our own habits for our own information consumption.
All right, students being resistant to critical analysis. Sean is commenting, it is, quote, too hard, and quote, takes too much time. How might this be addressed?
It is too hard. But I think one of the things I try to suggest is that I don't think most young people want to be manipulated. I don't think most young people want to be fooled by a piece of misinformation. And I think it's a recognition that, like, you can be easily manipulated by a piece of misinformation. And yes, it's really easy for you to let that wash over you, and maybe you just retweet it and move on. But if you don't want to be fooled, if you don't want to be misled, it does take some effort. Even if you don't go through the full processes of verifying everything, at least maybe do enough to make sure that you're not sharing something that's not true. Because when you share something that's not true, that's your reputation that you've just put out there. It's not just the source of what you got it from. So I think that when we talk about this, it is difficult, but if we really want to make sure that we know what is true, what we can verify, it does take effort. And I think emphasizing that you don't want to be fooled or manipulated, because that's not a fun feeling.
Kids don't like being wrong.
What else do we have?
Gosh, there are so many.
I see one here from Shauna Thorup. Does NLP provide any lessons that are ready to import into learning management systems such as Canvas, Google Classroom? We do not have full integration. We do have single sign-on right now with Google. So students and teachers can create accounts using their Google credentials. We are working on a couple of others that we're hoping to implement for next year. Let's see.
We have a, I'm just, never mind. I'm going to type that answer.
So Liz Shinohara says, I thought Fox was the least biased, at least in use of language, but knowing that they left info out, is that like bias by omission? It can be, but I think the important point that I want to emphasize with that question is that what you've asked is a more objective question as opposed to a more subjective one based on perception, right? And that's the type of more academic question, more critical question that we want young people to be able to answer. Is that bias by omission? Some people may say yes, some people may say no, but I hope that you can sort of see how that's a more objective way of talking about bias than just, you know, Fox good, Fox bad, and that sort of thing. Okay, let's see. Len asks, as we all likely did at one time, we reflected the views and values of our parents. So do you have a recommendation for how students can broach the subject of evaluating sources with parents? One of the things that we've seen anecdotally is that when students go through our curriculum, when they go through the Checkology virtual classroom and a number of other resources, they do take these home and start having some conversations with their parents. I think some of the skills that I mentioned in this webinar are good opening points for having these conversations about what's going on in the world, because I know that, you know, as we're stuck at home, as we have this pandemic that's affecting all of us and we're being bombarded with information about it, it can be overwhelming. And I think that it's a good opportunity, not just for us as adults and parents, but I think it's a good opportunity for young people to talk about, okay, so what is it that we can actually rely on? Where can I go to know what's really going on in terms of this virus and this pandemic? Because there's a lot of really dangerous conspiracy theories out there. And there's a lot of also very dangerous misinformation with some of the hyper-partisan positions on both sides. And so having a conversation about, okay, so what can we objectively look at? How can we be more reliably informed? How can we avoid some of these conspiracy theories and the blatant misinformation? So honestly, I think in some ways this pandemic, because it is affecting all of us, is a good starting point to start talking about what's reliable news and information, as opposed to just opinion, conjecture, or even straight up conspiracy theories.
We have
go ahead.
Real quick, this is great segue. Do we have plans for expanding lessons offerings for community college educators and students? So we can talk a little bit about our future.
Yeah, sort of. So we are working right now on, so our priorities for this upcoming summer for the Checkology virtual classroom is really more about improving the platform, making it easier and more effective for educators to implement it into their classes. We're developing a new lesson on conspiratorial thinking. And we're doing a few other things. Over the next few years, we are looking at the standards, creating the news literacy standards, starting with about grade 4 and then looking into post-secondary. After we develop those standards, then we're going to take a look at how we can adjust some of our curriculum to reach some of those other grade levels. I think the Checkology virtual classroom has some amazing resources for those first couple of years of college. And we do have a number of post-secondary institutions that are using Checkology. But I think it's just one of those things that, you know, Checkology is 4 years old. And it's come a long way in those 4 years. And I'm really excited to sort of see where we take it in the next several years. And if you stick with us and you keep working with us and we keep working with you, you're going to see some really cool things. So Kate Herzog asked, do I feel Jim Lehrer's 9 rules? I am ashamed to admit I don't know Jim Lehrer's 9 rules, but I'm going to have to look those up and I will let you know about those. If somebody is familiar with them, if you could maybe put that in the chat box, I'll take a look, but I feel like I should know those.
Okay, and just a reminder again, because there's still plenty of questions coming in, if we don't get to them right now, We will afterwards in a doc that we'll put in our resource folder, and you'll get that in an email afterwards with links and all sorts of goodies, including the presentation.
So Ruta Pascorius asked about developing materials for younger students. Yeah, we are working. We're not going to be developing necessarily as young as kindergarten. So you asked K to 6. The younger age range that we're focusing on where our standards right now is 4 to 6. A lot of the research that I've read and some people that I've talked to about child development and some of the concepts that we're teaching, about 3rd or 4th grade seems to be a really good starting point for a lot of these skills. So that's kind of where we're focusing. Journalism curriculum. Jordan Hopkins asked where we can find free and quality journalism curriculum. That's not the High Five curriculum. We'll do some research and see if we can find some stuff for you. But I will say that in the Checkology Virtual Classroom, we have a lesson called Practicing Quality Journalism. It's a really amazing simulation activity that students learn the standards of quality journalism by taking on the role of a reporter and actually producing a news piece.
How is misinformation different than disinformation?
The differences can be very subtle. I think there are some academic definitions that are out there. I think part of it goes to intent. Disinformation is deliberately created to be false. This is one way of looking at it. Whereas misinformation could be something that is just that. So for example, part of it could be true, but it's been taken out of context, it's been manipulated. So the differences can be very subtle and gray. A lot of it does come down to intent. We do tend to use them interchangeably sometimes, but that's kind of the way to get to it. And that's kind of the best way I can explain it off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to put together some more concrete definitions to send on that when I follow up. Marsha Blackburn asked ETA on the conspiratorial thinking resources. Right now, we are targeting to have that lesson ready for the Checkology Virtual Classroom for the next school year, hopefully by early September. So we're still on target for that as far as I know. We're having a lot of fun trying to develop it, but it's, like bias, it's a very complex topic, and we're working on it.
Sherry says she teaches a social media and news literacy course to seniors. It's a half-year course, and I always struggle with how to lay out my curriculum. How would you suggest I scaffold the skills I teach?
I think starting with some of the more basic concepts like news versus opinion, really getting into what news is, what those standards of quality journalism is, focusing on the things that we can verify and we can know that reliably are true. Start there, and how to do the fact checking, because you have to know how to do the fact checking before you can really teach how to investigate different types of misinformation. So that's a good starting point, and then you can go deeper from there. Barbara Connolly asked the app. It's called Informable. We'll send out a link in the follow-up. I'm going to try to get like maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll kind of wrap up. Roberto Rodriguez, this might be going down a rabbit hole. How do we navigate the conversation about anonymous sources? Surely there's an amount of trust that must happen. How do I explain that process to people? So one really important thing to remember is that anonymous sources actually aren't completely anonymous. Whoever that source is, that we usually more accurately refer to them as an unnamed source. The journalist, and likely at least 1 or more editors at that news organization, know the identity of that source. And when a reputable news organization is using an anonymous source, they don't just tell us what that source told them. They will also tell us why that source is anonymous and the justification for like why they chose to protect that person's anonymity. We need to be able to see that. That's part of that accountability and transparency. If somebody's just using an anonymous source and they're not telling us why, that's questionable. in terms of why we're looking at that. So it's really understanding when and why news organizations will use an unnamed source. We do have a link. We do have an article on our website about the use of unnamed sources. I will be sure to include a link to that in the follow-up email, so you can read a bit more about that. Okay. Christopher Howell asked, what do I think of the use of allsides.com or the media bias fact check app? I think those can be very effective tools if we're evaluating the commentary and the opinion pieces of a source of information, but they are really difficult to use if we're talking about news. Liz is along those same lines. I'm always surprised to see Al Jazeera labeled in those charts you mentioned as center. Do I agree? I don't necessarily agree with any of the determinations in these charts because I don't always know how they reach those decisions. I think that if I look at the news coverage from Al Jazeera, I'm going to be looking for those standards of quality journalism. And it's not, I don't want to evaluate the entire organization. I want to evaluate the individual pieces of information. Should we differentiate between print and visual media? I would think New York Times looks very different from Fox News. Can they be compared? That's from Katie Voss. I think if we're talking about news pieces, they absolutely can be compared. The difference is that in a print piece, you're going to have a lot more information to see for yourself. There's going to be a lot more detail in there, whereas a visual media, such as a television news piece, is not going to have as much. But a responsible journalist who's trying to tell us the news, instead of having all those details in print, they will tell us these things. They'll tell us, or they'll show us on the screen who this source is that they're talking to. That person's name will be there, their job title, where they are. Like, we have to look for the details on the screen so that we have context. And those standards are still going to be present. They're just going to be presented differently. Okay, let's see. Aren't there degrees of bias? This is from Jennifer Schussman. Aren't there degrees of bias even when the source is meant to reflect opinions? In other words, don't some base their opinions on fact versus conspiracies? Well, I think, yes, that's a really good point, but I think what you're really emphasizing there is the difference between opinion and propaganda. An organization that's trying to persuade us using logic and reason and evidence and things like that, quality opinions, there could be different degrees of bias. But the reality is that the more you see that bias, the more extreme it is, you're going to be getting away from opinion and more into propaganda. Okay, let me just sort of see if there's, so Greg Smith said, I mentioned Stanford Civic Online Reasoning. Can it be used to supplement newslets, Checkology, etc.? Are they mutually exclusive as platforms? So the Stanford History Education Group's curriculum is mostly downloadable worksheets. It is not an interactive online learning platform like Checkology is. They are not mutually exclusive. They just focus on a couple of very specific things. So their Civic Online Reasoning focuses on things like evaluating if something has evidence or not, and then lateral reading and fact-checking using lateral reading. So you can use their curriculum as a supplement to a lot of the things that we also do in Checkology. And you can see some of what they also have. We also have some of these skills in what's called the Check Center in Checkology.
Ria is asking if there are any books you would recommend for a high school library on this topic.
Books. Honestly, no, not off the top of my head. But I think we might be able to do a little bit of research to see if maybe we can find one or two.
Okay, we'll add that to the answers later.
Okay. Man, I love, there's so many questions.
The survey link in the chat.
Here's a long one. That's a long enough to take a look at. Tina Louth says, talk to your librarians. Yes, absolutely. If you are not engaging your librarians in this work, you are missing out on probably one of the most important resources in your schools and your districts. They have been doing this for a lot longer than most of us probably realize. They have access to a lot of great information and databases. Librarians really do need to be the focal point of a lot of this work, especially if we're going to start doing some cross-curricular engagement. Teresa Goff asks, is the focus always American, or do you include news from elsewhere in the SIFT? So she's writing from Canada. Yes, we do include some international pieces in the SIFT each week. Our mission is primarily focused on the American education system and the things that are happening in the United States. But my colleagues, Peter Adams and Susanna Gonzalez, they're the ones that write the SIFT. They do include information from outside the United States, usually in the SIFT. Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap up here. I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us today. We had an incredible turnout. We actually still have over 260 people on this webinar. So I just want to, if you haven't had a chance to do the survey, please take a few minutes to do the survey. And we will be sending out an email in the next day or so with a lot of these links. We'll have a link to register for the other 3 webinars that are happening over the next 3 weeks. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media, or you probably have either my email or Miriam's email. Please absolutely feel free to email us directly, and we will be in touch and hopefully keeping this conversation going. So thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful day. Best of luck with your remote learning, and please let us know however we can help to bring news literacy to you and your classes and your students.
Appreciate